just kind of
No, it's totally fine. I mean,
troubleshooting.
I think that's totally fine. It's a new platform and it's
Yeah,
understandable.
yeah, it's
Just
new to us, but we've been having a lot of fun
no, it's totally fine. I mean,
discovering
I
it.
think, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you guys can so basically you can also like, if you can obviously make your own gather spaces, and they have like games, so you can play like multiplayer games with sort of people, so you can play like chess and like all these other games, like sort of kind of in this sort of pseudo in-person way, which is really
It's
cool.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Did you try taking the quiz yourself, or did someone else try
No,
taking
I
it?
haven't done it yet. I haven't made an avatar for myself because I'm in the main like I'm not in front of a computer, so I'm
Oh, I
just
see
talking
Fanny is
to
joining.
Doug is the person who's running the four space avatar on the computer, and I'm in the space just on the microphone speaking to you. So
Okay.
I do believe that right now it's working where we are sharing the live stream via Zoom.
Oh, really? It's working and there's sound?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we're just gonna listen in on another device to see. We're just logging into another device to check it.
Okay, cool. Maybe I'll go say hi to Fanny.
Yeah, go.
All right.
Okay. On my Zoom.
What happened to Fanny?
Navigate the space. It's so cool. Yeah. So like we go into rooms? Is that it?
And walk up to like a space.
Okay.
And then you basically
Like conference.
yeah, so like the Concordia, they do like their own conference.
Yeah.
So I made it for that, and I tried to make like a slightly different poster, like I made it more like cartoony and like with with like more graph.
Hey, Doug, do you want to move over next to Tanya? I'll let her know that our volume's good to go, our sound is good to go, and then. Oh,
Hi.
Hi, Tanya. So we are hearing everything now and seeing everything now. I can send you the YouTube link in a minute, but just ensure you turn the sound off so you don't get feedback.
Sure.
But if you want to go ahead and yeah, tell us, introduce yourself, and then we'll take a tour of the space with you and hear more about your work.
Yeah, fantastic. So are we starting? Should we start?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So good afternoon. Thank you everyone for coming to this virtual symposium. There's various, I guess, terms for how I've sort of envisioned this space. I mean, it's an exposition, it's a symposium, it's a collection of my research. And to introduce myself, I'm Tanya. I am a fifth year graduate student in John Molson School of Business in the Department of Marketing. And my research focuses on primarily two subjects. So I study choice deferral, which is the act of putting off decisions. And I also study difficult trade offs that consumers have to make in choices. So I study trade offs like quality and quantity. So, a lot of times you're in the store and you're faced with, buying a pack of pens, let's say that is has more number of pens versus a pack of versus maybe a single pen that's really high quality and they're the same price. And so when the price is the same, trading off quality versus quantity can be a difficult decision that consumers have to make. So those are the kind of questions that I examine. And so I created this space so that it's some sort of an immersive environment where you can actually in some sort of interactive way experience my research. So we can walk over to the first exhibit, which is sort of a poster.
Oh, maybe we need to follow Tanya. She's at the poster on the.
Like I said, is the act of putting off decisions. And what happens is that, a lot of times we go into the store or we are shopping online and we want to buy something. But then, either we see too many options or we don't have enough information or we don't have enough money or we don't have enough time to make the decision. So we end up putting the decision off. And what I examine is what happens once we decide to suspend a decision? What happens once we put off a decision? So there's been a lot of research already in marketing that has looked at why consumers put off decisions. And we know that there's a typology of reasons, so there's uncertainty in terms of, people don't know enough information about the options. There are too many options. So sometimes assortment size is very large and you cannot make a decision. And sometimes it's, a lack of money or a lack of time. But my research focuses on the consequences of choice deferral. So the way we study this, and this is sort of research that I've done with my dissertation supervisor, Professor Caroline Rue, who's also in the Department of Marketing. And so basically, in order to study this, we first have to manipulate choice deferral. So we have to randomize our subjects into a deferral condition and a control condition. So the way we do this is by using a scenario where we ask them to imagine that their phone screen has cracked. So you have a smartphone, the screen has cracked. This is a phenomenon that, a situation that a lot of us have been in. And then you're sort of asked to imagine that you either fix the screen right away, which is sort of the control condition, or you wait to fix the screen for a later time, which is the deferral condition. And then we measure how often people defer subsequent decisions. And what we find is that when people defer, after initial deferral, people are more likely to defer subsequent choices. So we find this sort of main effect, which is that deferral begets future deferral. And then we try and figure out why this might be happening. So the underlying mechanism we think is that once deferral basically it can so deferral can actually increase self-confidence. And the reason that we think that it can increase self-confidence is because I meant deferral can actually decrease self-confidence. And the reason why we think deferral decreases self-confidence is because once you defer, you may doubt your decision-making abilities. So basically, because you deferred, you may think when you get to a subsequent decision that, oh, I wasn't able to make a decision on the previous choice. And so you might doubt your decision-making abilities. And then you might say, well, I'm not sure if I can make a choice now. And so that may then lead to subsequent deferral. So we think that deferral leads to a lower self-confidence, which then leads to greater deferral on subsequent decisions. And so we test this and we find support for this prediction. And then the follow-up study that we do is we do a sort of what's called in consumer behavior research a moderation, which means that we basically try and find a variable that can influence this main effect. So we find that our main effect is that deferral leads to subsequent deferral, and then we try and find a variable that can actually influence this main effect. And so in our case, what we find is that the product category of the subsequent choice, but if it's related versus unrelated, that can actually moderate this effect. So if you go through the poster, you can see that we look at product categories that are related and unrelated. So in the initial scenario, we again have the phone screen that's cracked. And then in the follow-up choice, we have a related product category, which is headphones, and an unrelated product category, which is sort of buying a suitcase, buying a piece of luggage. And so what we find is that the effect actually changes depending on whether the subsequent category is related or unrelated. So that sums up the sort of deferral research. And there are many implications of this research because firstly, in terms of the consequences of deferral, this is one of the first studies that examines the consequences of deferral. As I said before, a lot of research has focused on why deferral occurs, but not a lot of research has focused on what happens once deferral occurs. So we find this novel sort of deferral momentum effect where when you defer on the first decision, you're more likely to defer subsequent choices. And so we think that this has sort of interesting and important consequences, both for consumers and for marketers. So that sums up this particular research topic. And now we can walk over to the second project. So here we can see the poster. And this project basically started out as my own experiences with, sort of trying to carry out these difficult trade-offs between quality and quantity. And what I found was that, this was a sort of ubiquitous phenomenon that, I found if you look at consumer packaged goods in, a sort of grocery store aisle or a pharmacy aisle, you will often find products where, the prices are relatively similar, but then the quantity that you receive versus the quality that you receive has to be traded off. And so usually, we tend to use price as an indicator, of quality or of preference. But when price is the same, then you have to, refer to other attributes. And so in this case, the question that we're asking is, in general about quality quantity trade-offs, but specifically about how resource scarcity can impact quality quantity trade-offs. Because from a sort of layman's perspective, we might expect that people who are undergoing resource scarcity, they might immediately want to buy high quantity options because, they are in a sort of, they might want to acquire as many resources as possible because they feel like, their resources are limited. So if I go into the store with a limited amount of money, with a limited budget, I might want to get as much material or as much product as possible for the limited amount of money that I have. But what we find actually is sort of counterintuitively that in some cases, those under scarcity can actually prefer the high quality option, which actually, they sacrifice on quantity, but they actually pick the high quality option. And so the reason why we think this might be happening is because when you are undergoing resource scarcity, you feel sort of mentally constrained, and buying something that is perceived as indulgent or as high quality might actually give you sort of, a feeling of freedom from the constraint that you're experiencing. So that momentary indulgence might give you a sort of sense of freedom from the constrictive sense of scarcity that you're feeling. And so I won't go into all the details of the experiments that we ran, but basically we manipulated resource scarcity by using a listing task. And then thereafter we had participants choose between, so participants were randomized into a scarcity condition or a control condition. And then they were asked to choose between a high quality and a high quantity option. And so as you can see here, some of our stimuli are shown here. So we had this sort of 2-pack of high quality pens versus a pack of like 8 low quality, high quantity pens. And then again, in the second study, we had this sort of one chocolate, one sort of very fancy Godiva truffle versus three low quality Dove truffles. And then finally, in the third study, we find basically what we call a boundary condition, which is basically what that means is that we find a sort of a value where the effect is no longer valid. So basically, we find the parameter space where the effect does exist, and then we find the boundary of the effect. And that happens when basically when we increase the quantity that's involved. So when you have a choice between two relatively high quantity items, people under scarcity will always go for like the higher quantity, because then the resource acquisition drive that scarcity produces, that sort of overtakes the feeling of constraint drive. So basically, it depends on, the outcome depends on the options, and also sort of, how constrained people are feeling under scarcity. So that summarizes that second project that I have. And the other objects that we have here in this space are, so if you'd like to learn about um, consumer research, I have designed this very basic survey that you can sort of take to see if you know about some common cognitive biases that consumers might be subject to. And so when you click on this, link, when you try to interact with this object, it opens up a survey. And when you click on the survey, um, it'll basically take you to a Qualtrics questionnaire that you can take. And it's not just a quiz, it's also like it just doesn't test your knowledge. I also have explainers as part of the quiz, where I'm trying to elucidate the different cognitive biases that you might encounter when you make decisions. And hopefully this will give you a bit of insight into how decision making happens, and help you in making better decisions, or help you in identifying sort of cognitive biases that you might become prey to when you make decisions. So that's the decision making quiz. Finally, here there's a video where I talk about my research. This is part of my public scholarship. And so as part of the public scholarship tenure, we recorded videos, short snippets to describe our research. And so you can watch this 50-second video where I talk about my research, and sort of just summarize what my research is based on, and what the motivations for my research are. And then what happens when we put off decisions? I run experiments with online participants where they are randomly asked to put off a decision or decide right away. After this scenario, I ask them to make more choices. I find that deferring a choice makes you put off more choices in the future. This may be because the deferral registers as an inability to make a choice, making you doubt your decision-making abilities and thereby leading to even more indecision. It's also possible that deferral makes you more optimistic about the future, and so you put off more choices because you're convinced that the future will be better. As the pandemic forced us to re-evaluate our priorities, we put off a lot of decisions. My research is shedding light on what the impact of these delays might be, and how we can potentially counteract them. Hi. Hi.
Hi, Tanya. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thanks
I'm
for
good.
coming.
Yeah, my meeting ended early, so I was like, yes, I want it. I could come now, and I'm doing things now. And it's so great to be here. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, no problem. Thank you for coming. Yeah, I hope you enjoy like exploring the space. I had a lot of fun like building it. And it's really like a fun sort of platform.
It's very fun. Thank you so much. All the
No
efforts
problem.
that you put in, it's amazing. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Thanks, SG. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Tanya. I think we might go and listen to your podcast so that we can stream it.
Oh, that might be cool.
How's
Yeah,
that?
cool.
How long is it? Play for?
It's like 30 minutes, but you can also just like, I mean, if it's like boring or whatever, you can just skip bits.
It will not be boring.
you, you don't have to listen to the whole thing. Like, I mean, yeah, I think I also only heard it like once because I mean, it's so cringy to listen to your own voice too. So I was just because the person sent it back to me and they're like, oh, you have to listen to it and tell me if I need to edit something out. And I was like, oh my God, I don't want to listen to like 30 minutes of me just rambling on about my research. But yeah.
Well, I'd like to hear it. So I think we'll go over it and take a listen if that's okay with you.
Yeah. That's totally fine.
Okay.
I'm glad you guys are enjoying the space.
Thanks, Tanya.
Welcome to Abstract: The Future of Science. I'm your host, Jeremy Ullman, and today, as always, we are bringing unprecedented accessibility to graduate research. We recorded in the past, you're listening in the present, and we're discussing the future of science. Enjoy the show. This is Abstract. You know what it is. Another excellent episode coming your way right this moment. I'm super excited to be introducing Tanya Singh to the show today. Tanya, welcome. How's it going?
I'm good, Jeremy, and thank you for having me on this excellent podcast.
Yes, it is an excellent one, ain't it? Okay, so before we get into things, please go ahead and tell me and the listeners who you are and what it is that you do.
Sure. So I am a PhD candidate in marketing at the John Molson School of Business at Concordia University in Montreal. And I study the psychological and behavioral consequences of putting off decisions. I'm basically interested in also sort of trade-offs like trading off quality and quantity. And in addition to my current PhD, I actually have a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in evolutionary biology. As far as my interests go, I love hiking. I love cuddling with my dog, who's old and grumpy. And I also daydream about owning an ice cream shop.
I love that. Would your dog be beside you in that ice cream shop?
Sure. I mean, he would be the mascot, I'm pretty sure.
That's amazing. Oh, God. We can maybe talk about the ice cream shop a little bit later. That's kind of in line with one of my dreams of opening a patisserie and just making special desserts every day for people to come in and just try them out. But in any event, we're here for the science, and then we'll talk about dessert a little bit later. So thank you so much for being here again, Tanya. We're going to hop right into things. So, a few months ago, we had Alexa Ruel on the show in the first installment of what I hope to be a series of decision-making episodes here on Abstract. That was episode 53, where we discussed the topics of cost-benefit analysis, cognitive effort, mental models, and the role of memory in decision-making. So today, we're going to pick up where we left off in a sense, but shift from the purely psychological aspects of choice to focus more on the marketing and behavioral aspects of it as well. So already in the introduction you gave for yourself, you mentioned something about timing. How does the timing of choices factor into the decision-making process? What is the role of time?
So that's a very good question. When it comes specifically to choice deferral, which is sort of putting off choices, the role of time has been looked at. So, we might think of time as one of the major variables because time is crucial to making a decision, right? Sometimes when we go to the store, we don't have an infinite amount of time to decide, what milk we want to buy or what kind of pasta sauce we want to buy, right? So a lot of times, like, we will rely on shortcuts, cognitive shortcuts or heuristics to reduce the amount of time that we use to make a decision. So a lot of it basically gets into habitual shopping. So I will buy a brand that's familiar to me, that I've been buying since I was 10, in terms of milk, or, the kind of milk that my mom was feeding me when I was a kid. And so time basically then becomes important when you are in a context where you're not familiar with the options. And so you have to spend more time to understand what the options are, to trade off the various attributes, to, basically gather more information. And what's been seen, at least in the choice deferral literature, is that when you have more time to make a decision, you're actually more likely to defer choice. And the reason for that is the more time you have, the more sort of there's an escalation of commitment. And so you want to make a better decision because you're allocating more time to the decision. And so that increases the stakes for the choice. So in contrast to this, counterintuitively, when you have lesser time, you actually use more simple decision-making rules. So you say, okay, product A has 3 attributes, product B has 3 attributes, but because I'm low on time, I'm only going to focus on the attribute that I really care about. Whereas if you were making a decision in a unlimited time frame, you would say, oh, I care about attribute A, I also care about attribute B, I also care about attribute C. And so you're going to take more time to compare the 2 products across these attributes. So in some sense, actually, counterintuitively, time pressure can actually accelerate choice making.
The way that you're describing decision making, it almost sounds more rigid and calculated than it feels. Like there is this subjective feeling of trying to decide between 2 or more things. And even just continuing with the grocery example, I love grocery shopping. I find it extremely enjoyable. But when I'm deciding between multiple options, I honestly can't really think of a time where I was consciously comparing multiple criteria. Very often at the grocery store, the main criterion is price. If there are 2 similar products and one is cheaper, I'll just go for that one because I don't have extremely strong preferences one way or another. But why is there a difference, maybe at least this is from personal experience, between the subjective experience of comparison and the actual underlying mechanisms of like trait comparison? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yes, in addition to the actual cognition that's going on, there's also a subjective or abstract feeling of how your thought process during making the choice. So what research has found is that some processes just have a metacognitive fluency about them. So what means is, even though the task may be a bit difficult, you're used to doing the task, and so it feels fluent in your mind. But when a task is new, for example, there's been some research on fluency which basically looks at making the same decision, but in one condition, the information about the decision, so the information about the choice, is presented to you using a font that's hard to read, and in another condition, the same information is presented in a font that's easy to read. So now basically you have the same information, but just the difficulty of reading it has been manipulated.
Okay.
And so what's been seen is that when the font becomes difficult to read, the metacognitive fluency associated with that choice becomes lower. So people associate that choice with a sort of more difficult metacognition. And the interesting thing here is that people interpret that choice is more difficult. So even though the choice is exactly the same, because the information is exactly the same, they attribute that metacognitive difficulty to the choice. So they're not able to disentangle the fact that the choice itself is not difficult. It's just the way the choice is presented that's difficult.
Yeah, that
also,
makes sense.
maybe another variable that probably plays into this is the involvement in the choice. And I want to go back to what you said about price, because price is also a very important variable. Price is not just an indicator in and of itself. It's also an indicator of other attributes such as quality, right? So we often use, that's a heuristic that we often use price as a sort of proxy for quality. So if we see something that's more expensive, we say, oh, this is expensive because it's rare or really high quality and uses really high quality ingredients. So even though that doesn't seem very conscious, that is subconsciously happening in our brains.
There was an interesting thing directly related to this happened to me yesterday at the grocery store. I was in the cookie aisle. I swear I wasn't buying any of it. I was just looking, and there were two different brands of wafers. And one of the brands of wafers was like the supermarket brand. The packaging was very simple, and it was like on sale. It was like 99 cents, which is crazy cheap for wafers. Now I've already had these wafers, and they're horrendous. But there's another package of wafers that was $3, which I have had, which I know is better. But there was something about just the fact that there was that price differential. Having the $3 wafer next to the $1 wafer made the $1 wafer seem even that much lower quality. Because if someone's charging $3, you must be making a pretty bad product if you can get away for charging a third of the price. So not only is price this indicator of quality, but you almost get this like situational influence of one price compared to another. And so this just, obviously the complexity builds here tremendously.
That's a really important example, and I think it gets into one of the most common effects that we see in marketing, which is sort of the compromise effect, right? So if you had a $1 wafer and a $3 wafer, and let's say there was also a $2 wafer for sale, you would 100% or with a high probability go for the $2 wafer, because you're like, I'm not that indulgent that I'm going to buy a $3 wafer, but I'm also not going for the crap $1 wafer that I don't know, has probably some chemical additives that I don't want to ingest, right? And
That's a great point.
So this is a very, this is how price can really influence our decisions, right? And you're right, in a contextual setting, it can have a huge effect.
I've heard of a similar example. I don't know if this came up on the episode with Alexa, but I've heard it elsewhere. At movie theaters, there is this phenomenon where they have 3 sizes of popcorn. And the difference in the price between the medium popcorn, for example, and the large popcorn, being the 2 larger sizes, is so small that people just end up buying the large popcorn. Because let's say it's an outrageous price for medium, but it's a slightly more outrageous, but not incredibly more outrageous price for large, you'll just pay the extra $1 or 2 to get the huge increase. Even though both of those are just ridiculously priced. It's like the medium, by being expensive, ends up making the large seem less expensive relatively, even though they're both ridiculous compared to a small, for example.
Yeah.
So this seems like it's kind of the same thing happening.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, basically, it's about how there can be decoys, what we call in the marketing literature decoys, right? So basically, it's something that's been deliberately placed in order to increase the incidence of choice of another option. In the case of the compromise effect, there's a decoy that's lower priced, or there's a decoy that's higher priced that will increase the incidence of choice of the medium priced item. And it's a win-win, right? So either people buy the medium or they buy the large, which is, if there's a very small difference in price, the company's still making a lot of money. I mean, the other strange cognitive bias that comes in there is this bias of anchoring, right? So we look at a price and we forget about everything else that we know about the world because we're like, oh, this is what popcorn is priced at. And we forget that, or maybe we sort of remember that, oh, you can buy popcorn for like 99 cents that you can microwave and make in your house. Yeah. But then we're like, no, this makes sense.
Yeah, you get blinders on, price blinders.
Exactly. So it's a combination of, these different cognitive biases that are at play.
Cool. Yeah. So you've mentioned directly, but also in passing, this notion of familiarity, which is really important in the decision-making process, and like familiarity, information gathering. You did drop a term really early on, which was choice deferral, right? So you're mentioning choice deferral. When we first spoke, you mentioned that you've actually coined a term yourself related to this. I'm not going to say the term because I want you to be the one to say it for the first time on the show. And I want you to tell me a little bit about how you came to create this terminology. Tell us a bit about this new term that is essentially one of the focuses of your research.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for bringing that up. It is indeed a term that I've coined, although it is related to another phenomenon that occurs in consumer research.
Sure.
So basically, I study choice deferral, and choice deferral is the putting off of choices. So, something that consumers do all the time. You may go to the grocery store. I don't know why we're talking about grocery stores. We probably like shopping a lot. So when you go to the grocery store, you might be interested in buying pasta sauce. And so you might see, 3 different brands and you're not able to decide which brand you want. So you basically say, okay, forget it. I'm going to get pasta sauce next week. So that's basically what deferral is. You're putting off a choice for a later time. So you haven't said, I don't want pasta sauce. You've just said, I want pasta sauce, but I'm not going to decide just now. I'm going to put it off for another time.
Right. Here's the timing kind of coming into things again, right?
Exactly. Time is one aspect of the choice that I don't look at directly. But what I am interested in is sort of what happens once you put off the choice. So does that
Sure.
impact choices that come downstream? How does that impact your psychological mindset? And so what we do is we run experiments and primarily online because, this has been happening during COVID.
Yeah.
We ask online participants to, we first randomly assign them into a deferral scenario or a control scenario. And so in the deferral scenario, we show them a phone screen that's cracked. And we basically say, look, this has happened. Your phone screen is cracked. And you've decided to put off repairing your screen. So that's the deferral condition. And then in the control condition, we basically show them a phone screen that's cracked. And we say, look, this has happened. And you've decided to fix your phone screen right away. And then we ask them to elaborate on, why they would fix the screen right away or why they would defer fixing the screen to basically drive home the manipulation.
Okay.
So once they've been through this manipulation, we then ask them to make subsequent choices. We ask them to make more choices that are unrelated. So we ask them to choose between two different digital cameras. So we show them like two cameras, we show them the attributes of the cameras, and then we say, do you want to choose option A? Do you want to choose option B? Or do you want to choose neither and keep looking for other options? So that constitutes the deferral option.
Okay.
And so basically what we do is we give them a string of 4 choices that they can make. So there's digital cameras, there's laptops, there's vacations, and there's apartments. We had to take the vacation out because it was COVID and it was really triggering people. So we had to replace that.
These are all pretty big ticket items. I'm curious to know if you ever ran something like this with like more small items.
That's a good point. We did not. Choice
Okay.
deferral is something that has been looked at in the past in the marketing literature, but primarily what's been looked at is the reasons for choice deferral. So basically the precursors of choice deferral, the antecedents of choice deferral.
Sure.
These questions are sort of derived from the literature. So we haven't made these questions up. The one thing about doing research is you sort of want to stop reinventing the wheel, right? So you want to invent something new. And so that's why we always stand on the shoulders of people who have come before us and use measures that have been used by people who have done research before us.
Right, yeah, so same wheel, new spokes.
Exactly. So what we find is that when we ask people to make subsequent choices after they've deferred or after they've been assigned to the random deferral scenario, they actually tend to defer more. So the people in the deferral scenario tend to defer more choices subsequently. And this is a pretty significant effect. So what we're seeing is that there's a huge difference in the number of subsequent deferrals among the people who are in the deferral versus the control scenario. And so we've coined this the deferral momentum effect. And there seems to be this sort of indecision that compounds over time. And so it seems to get stronger with subsequent decisions.
Interesting.
So that's why we call it a momentum.
I have to just comment on this. I know before I touched on the fact that you've mentioned familiarity repeatedly so far. Does the act of deferring become a familiar action that begets more deferral? We spoke about familiarity in terms of products, but can familiarity also be in terms of our behaviors?
So that is a great point. So we haven't 100% figured out what the mechanism is, but we think we have a pretty good idea of what the mechanism is. And it's in part driven by what you said. It's this sort of familiarity with deferral and that becoming a sort of default behavior, right? So what we are trying to measure, or what we think might be happening, is that when you defer, what you're saying to yourself is that I'm putting this off for the future. And what that registers as in your brain is that the future is going to be better. When you put off something to the future, you basically say to yourself, oh, I'm going to have more money. I'm going to have more time. I'm basically going to have more resources to make this decision in the future, right? So you've basically said the present is not the right time for this decision. The future is the right time for this decision. You've somehow subconsciously convinced yourself that the future is going to be better. Then you say, oh, well, if the future is going to be better, I better put off this decision as well. I better put off the next decision as well. And I better put off the decision after that as well. I mean, this is what we think might be happening.
So I'm actually just realizing now, this is not the second installment of decision making on Abstract. This is the third installment of decision making. Way back a year ago, I had Austin Trudeau on the podcast, and we spoke about delayed discounting. And this idea of putting off is very reminiscent of that exact fact. How can we differentiate between someone who has very strong delayed gratification, who says, you know what, I don't need this sauce now, I can wait to have this sauce later? How do we compare that person's behavior to someone who has this deferral momentum building? Are they two sides of the same coin? How are they related?
So that's a great point. And I think they're definitely related. So we measure this thing that's called impulsivity, which basically gets into, an impatience to buy, and basically the opposite of delayed gratification, right? The instant gratification, the person who really wants to buy things now if they want something. And so what we're finding is that people who are impulsive, they don't defer. It is possible that people who have a tendency to sort of, engage in delayed discounting, sort of engage in this delayed gratification, they probably are more likely to defer as well because, they have a higher degree of patience, basically, right? They say that I can live with a phone that's not okay, and I can sort of wait to fix my phone. And I think that there are pros and cons to this. So if your phone is cracked and you say, oh, I'm not going to fix it right now, I'm okay with the phone and I'm just going to put it off. Your phone may fall again, and then the entire screen breaks off, and then you have to replace. It ends up being not just a $100 repair, but then like a $400 repair. So there is a risk to deferral, right? I mean, we might think of deferral as, oh, you're putting off consumption. It's such a good thing. You're going to save money. But it's not. No, it's not always good because you might really need something urgently and you might put it off. This is one side of the phenomenon that we're now trying to look at, like how deferral momentum can actually lead to suboptimal choices, right?
Yeah. If I had $1 for every time a scientist said, not always, I could retire right now. Because it's amazing how much research shows that there are tendencies in behavior, there are patterns in behavior, but very rarely, I'm realizing now after more than 60 episodes of recording this podcast, do things exist in an absolute way, especially when you're dealing with human behavior. People aren't like that. In terms of the timing, because time has been one main theme of the episode so far, it seems like there's really 3 time points for decision making. There's now, which is the impulsivity. There's later, which is the deferral or the delayed gratification. And then there's never. Where does the never part fit into decision making? It's kind of like the null decision for infinity. Like does that exist in your research? How does that figure into the picture?
So that's a really good question as well, because the way we measure deferral at this point has been, basically asking people, do you want option A, do you want option B, or do you want neither and continue looking for other options? Mm-hmm. We're thinking of adding a 4th option, which is sort of saying, do you not want this product at all, which is basically the refusal.
Okay. It
would be interesting to see if the deferral momentum would still be there if people just said, no, I don't want this.
Ooh, I like that. Like you could just nip the deferral in the bud by giving people a full out.
Yes. So another thing that is very hard to test, but it also something that might be happening is there's this construct called cognitive closure. So when we make a decision, some people's brains have a higher tendency to do this. They're wired to basically complete the loop. So the loop is, gathering information, deliberating, and then making a choice, right? So that completes the loop. But if you defer, you basically say, oh, I'm putting this off for another time. The loop isn't really closed because you haven't made the choice. You haven't made the decision. You've just put it off. You've just suspended it.
It's gather, deliberate, gather, deliberate, gather, deliberate.
Exactly. You just sort of keep going back and forth, right?
Yeah.
And so for some people who have a high need for cognitive closure, it's possible that deferral basically triggers this sense that something is incomplete. And then they can't progress with making another decision unless that first loop is complete. So basically they then go on deferring more decisions because, something isn't right. So it's possible that when you say no, that completes the loop because it's like, I don't want this, right? And it's different to putting off the decision.
It actually, it reminds me a little bit of like how you can run code. You can have a code that essentially iterates, and then once it hits a certain condition, it just exits that iterative loop. Maybe there is some kind of algorithm going on inside of our brains in this decision-making process.
Yeah, it's totally possible. The other thing that we've noticed with people who are in the deferral condition is that we ask them after they make a choice, how confident they feel about the choice, because we were wondering if deferral makes you less confident. So we thought that if deferral registers as the inability to make a choice, then you might doubt your decision-making abilities. You might say, oh, does that mean that I'm a poor decision maker? Does that mean I don't know enough to make decisions? And so that might deflate your confidence, right? And then we thought, oh, this confidence deflation maybe means that when you go to the next decision, you doubt your decision-making abilities again. And so then that means that you can't make a decision again. And then that deflates your confidence even further. So we thought that's the loop that's happening, like deferral is driving lower self-confidence, is driving more deferral, is driving lower self-confidence. And so it's a vicious cycle that never ends.
I think I want to coin a new term, which is confidence deflation momentum.
That's a good term. But I have to burst your bubble because that's not what's happening.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so when we measured confidence, we actually found that those who defer have a higher confidence.
Get out.
No, that's
Leave.
leave right now.
No, please stay. Okay. What? Can you explain that?
So what we think is happening is this thing called motivated reasoning. Basically, it's choice justification. So when you buy something, right? If people ask you after the choice what your attitude towards that option is, you will report a higher amount of liking. So like if you've just bought Nike sneakers and then I ask you, how much do you like Nike? You'll say, hell yeah, I like Nike. I just bought their sneakers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this motivated reasoning and this justification that goes on when you ask someone like, oh, you just made this choice. How confident are you? But we see that this is inflated for people who defer. So basically, there's something about deferral that is a bit off. And so in order to convince yourself that it's the right choice, you're like, oh no, I made the right choice. This is the right choice. And then that can really drive that consistency bias. So when I get to the next choice, you're like, oh, I deferred in that choice before, and that was the right choice for me. So I'm going to do it again. So
That's
basically,
crazy. That is a really unexpected effect.
yeah, so that's quite counterintuitive, at least for us it
Very,
was, and I think it
very.
is to most people who hear about it. And that's cool. And now we're trying to sort of unpack, why is this happening? Is it motivated reasoning? Is it something else that's driving this higher self-confidence?
Well, I'd be happy to ask you a question that might help elucidate something about this. You completed a previous PhD in evolutionary biology. How has your previous research in terms of completing that PhD actually influenced or informed your current research and maybe even helped you answer this question about why is it that we see this counterintuitive effect of increasing confidence with persistent deferral?
I think that when you learn evolution, as you were talking just a second ago, you really tend to think about it in terms of this bigger view of how things are changing, because it's a very long, in terms of time scales, it's very large time scales over which this process occurs. And so you have to have this, sort of big scale view of the world. And I think that makes us, even in marketing, you sort of have to have this big scale view of the world, because you're not looking at just one individual. You're looking at the sort of aggregate of a huge number of individuals and how they are likely to respond when things change this way or that.
Excellent. I just want to end on this one note. I want to ask you, in terms of the research that you've done so far in this PhD or even in both PhDs, how could you crystallize everything you've done so far in a single piece of advice you could give to myself and to the listeners, something that you've learned that you think can actually improve the quality of life and the life experience for an individual? What's the biggest life-changing takeaway you've come across so far? Take your time.
So I would basically say that whatever advice someone gives you about making decisions or making the right choice, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because one decision-making style doesn't work for everyone. I mean, if my research into human consumer decision-making has taught me anything, it's that people have different decision-making styles. And often what we think about making the best decision is gathering as much data as we can and going through all the data. That often doesn't, in the long term, doesn't mean the greatest well-being. So what I would say is, maybe this is sort of like the next direction, and it already seems to be the next direction in which decision-making is heading, is outsource as much decision-making as you can to a machine that can actually optimize the decision-making, right? And then
Okay.
and then take that and see how that fits in with your sort of actual preference, right? And then make a choice.
Okay, so you're vying for a human-computer interface of sorts to aid the decision-making process. I mean, that is definitely an interesting option, different way of thinking about it, interesting way to go.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the reason I feel that is because, I mean, if research has showed us anything, it's shown us that our rationality is bounded. You know, we have a bounded rationality.
Don't get me started on bounded rationality. The episode was supposed to be over 5 minutes ago. Oh my goodness. What, you know, I love coming to this point in the episode where it feels like we could start a whole new one right now. The beauty about this podcast is that, fingers crossed, it's going to be around for a very long time, and I would be happy to have you back on to talk about all the things we did not get to talk about, like bounded rationality. So let's just leave that as a cliffhanger for myself and the listeners, and give us something to look forward to next time you're around. So Tanya, thank you so much. Your presence here and your knowledge has been invaluable. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been fantastic, and it's definitely generated a lot of questions in my mind, which I will be pondering for the rest of my day.
Excellent. I thought you were going to say for the rest of my days, which would be a very different meaning. But in any event, thank you, thank you, thank you. Have an awesome rest of your day. You're great. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, you can check us out at AbstractCast on Instagram. If you have any feedback, please feel free to leave a comment on the post for the current or any previous episode that you might have listened to. Or if you're a graduate student and you would like to be on the podcast yourself, you can drop us a line at abstractcast@gmail.com. This podcast will be released weekly on Sundays and is also available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much everywhere else you're going to find podcasts. So feel free to check us out around the internet. Until then, take it easy.